who's actually going to get value out of a 980 nanometers high-power infrared dot laser, and who should just keep scrolling. If you're trying to decide whether to spend your money on an IR module that claims 4.8W output with a built-in FAC and a 6W diode, you're probably wondering if it will actually do anything useful for your hobby or project, or if you're just buying a piece of glass that will sit on a shelf. Link is in the description if you want to check the product details on Amazon. Let's walk through the real-world scenarios where this kind of laser makes sense, the hidden trade-offs you might not see in the headline specs, and whether the price tag feels justified for an everyday buyer. First off, the most common place you'll see a 980 nanometers infrared dot laser is in DIY laser engraving rigs or as a targeting aid for night vision setups. The wavelength sits squarely in the infrared band, which means it's invisible to the naked eye but perfect for cameras that can see IR, like many security or wildlife cams. If you're building a low-cost laser cutter for wood or acrylic, the 4.8W output can actually cut thin materials when paired with the right optics and a fast-moving gantry. That's the sweet spot. You get enough power to etch without having to invest in a multi-kilowatt industrial system. On the flip side, if you're a casual user who just wants a visible red pointer or a simple alignment tool for a home theater projector, this module is overkill. Because the beam is invisible, you'll need a camera or an IR-sensitive sensor to see where it's landing, which adds extra gear and can be a hassle if you're not already set up for that. In that case, you'd be better off with a cheap visible laser or even a cheap IR remote sensor that doesn't require a high-power diode. One practical strength of this Sunshine Electronics unit is the inclusion of a built-in FAC short for fast axis collimator. In plain English, that means the beam stays tight over a longer distance, which is something hobbyists often struggle with when they buy a bare diode and have to spend hours tweaking lenses. Users who have tried to mount a raw diode into a 3D-printed housing will know how quickly the spot can balloon into a fuzzy circle. The FAC in this module keeps the dot under a millimeter even at a few meters away, which translates directly into cleaner engravings or more accurate targeting. However, that advantage comes with a trade-off in heat management. The module lists a long-time working claim, but the real test is whether the heatsink can handle continuous operation. In forums, people who push 6W diodes for extended periods often need to add an external fan or a dedicated cooling block. If you plan to run the laser for long engraving jobs, you should budget for a small fan and monitor the temperature. Overheating will not only shorten the diode's lifespan but can also cause power fluctuations that ruin fine details. Another point that matters is the operating voltage and current draw. The module runs on a fairly typical 12V supply, but the working current can spike enough to make some cheap power adapters fizzle out. I've seen setups where a standard phone charger was enough for a few seconds of pulsing, but anything longer required a proper lab-style power supply. If you're integrating this into a portable Arduino-controlled rig, make sure your battery pack can sustain the current without dropping voltage. Otherwise, you'll get intermittent cuts or a dimming dot that looks like it's losing power. Now, who should actually buy this? If you're a maker who already has a CNC or a 3-axis plotter and you want to upgrade from a low-power diode to something that can actually carve shallow depths in wood, this module fits the bill. The 4.8W output sits nicely between the timid 1W hobby lasers that barely etch and the expensive multi-watt units that require industrial safety enclosures. Because the beam is invisible, you'll also need to take safety seriously. IR goggles rated for 980 nanometers are a must, and you should set up a dedicated work zone where stray reflections won't hit eyes or pets. If you're a photographer or wildlife observer looking for a discrete IR illumination source for nighttime shots, this can be a decent addition, but you'll need to pair it with a camera that can focus on a point source and a trigger that can modulate the beam. In that niche, the module's high power means you can illuminate a larger area than a cheap IR LED, but you also risk overexposing the scene if you don't dial down the duty cycle. On the other hand, if your project is simply, I need a pointer that my kids can see on a wall, skip this one. The invisible dot will frustrate anyone who doesn't have the right sensor, and the safety considerations become unnecessary baggage. For most casual users, a standard visible laser pointer does the job at a fraction of the price and without the need for IR blocking glasses. The rating.